I used to brag about my family like it was armor. I told people my parents, Karen and Tom, were strict but fair, and my older brother, Blake, was protective in his own rough way. I believed our house was solid, dependable, the kind of place you could always return to. That belief made me feel safe even when money was tight and tempers ran hot. On my 18th birthday, I walked into the kitchen expecting the usual routine, but still trusting them completely, because trust was the one thing I never questioned. When I was little, I measured love in small, ordinary things. A lunch packed the way I liked, a ride home when it rained, a hand on my shoulder when I was nervous. I didn't need grand gestures. I just wanted to feel included, like my presence mattered as much as Blake's. I learned early to be easy, to be low maintenance, to laugh at jokes that weren't funny. I told myself I was mature for my age, but really I was adapting. I was trying to earn my spot at the table without asking for it. The empathy I feel for that younger version of me still aches. She tried so hard to read moods, to anticipate needs, to prevent explosions before they happened. She swallowed disappointment like medicine and called it gratitude. She watched Blake receive praise for things she did too, and she decided the problem must be her. If she could just be quieter, kinder, smarter, then everyone would relax and love would come easier. That kid deserved someone to tell her love shouldn't feel like balancing on glass. Instead, she got smiles that faded fast and affection that always felt borrowed. As I got older, I noticed patterns I didn't want to name. Blake's mistakes were phases. Mine were attitude. When he needed help, my parents shifted their whole world to meet him. When I needed help, I got lectures about resilience. I kept telling myself it was normal, that older siblings just needed more, that my parents were stressed, that I was being sensitive. Trust makes you generous with explanations. It makes you translate cruelty into miscommunication. It makes you doubt your own instincts until you forget you had them. The anger didn't arrive all at once. It built like pressure behind a wall. It started with little humiliations, like my dad joking about how I was dramatic whenever I tried to explain myself, or my mom praising Blake for being low-key after he did the same thing I got punished for. I hated myself for feeling jealous, so I redirected that heat inward and called it motivation. But each time I bent, something inside me cracked. By 18, I wasn't just tired. I was furious, and I didn't know where to put it. On my birthday, they acted strangely calm, almost rehearsed. The cake was plain, the kitchen too clean, and Blake watched me with that half smirk he used when he knew something I didn't. My mom handed me an envelope first, not a hug. Inside was a short note about adult responsibilities and a list of chores I'd be expected to cover now that I was 18. My dad nodded like he'd delivered wisdom. I smiled anyway, because I didn't want to ruin the moment. I kept trusting them, because admitting distrust felt like betrayal. Then they cut me out in a way I still struggled to describe without my throat tightening. My dad slid a folder across the table and tapped it like it was nothing. Inside were printed bank statements, a lease renewal, and a page labeled Household Plan, with everyone's names except mine on the header. Under Blake's name were benefits: a key, a parking spot, access to the family savings, in emergencies. Under mine was a blank line, followed by a note about moving out by the end of the month. I stared at it, convinced I was misreading. Surprise hit first, sharp and dizzy, like the room tilted. I reread the page, hunting for an explanation, for a missing sheet, for proof that I was still included somewhere. My mom talked about healthy boundaries and fresh starts, words that sounded gentle but landed like doors slamming. My dad kept his eyes on the table, as if refusing to look at me made it cleaner. Blake's smirk widened, and something in me went cold with disbelief. I had trusted them completely, and they were calmly rewriting my place in the family. Sadness came last, heavy and humiliating, because it wasn't just about moving out. It was the realization that my role had always been temporary, conditional, disposable. I thought about every time I defended them to friends, every time I excused the imbalance, every time I told myself love was supposed to hurt a little. My chest felt hollow, like all my effort had been poured into a cup with a crack in the bottom. I didn't cry at the table. I couldn't. I just nodded, pretending I understood, while my mind raced with one question. If they could plan my disappearance so neatly, what else had they planned behind my back? I didn't pack that night. I couldn't. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the pale blue walls I had painted myself at 16, telling everyone it made the room feel calm. Suddenly, it looked like someone else's room. Like I was already a guest in a space I'd lived in for years. The house felt different too. Quieter. Not peaceful quiet. Planned quiet. The kind of silence that happens when a decision has already been made without you. I kept replaying the kitchen scene in my head. The folder. The blank line under my name. The words, "Move out by the end of the month." It wasn't a discussion. It wasn't even framed as a conflict. It was presented like logistics, like taking out the trash, like renewing a subscription you no longer use. That was the part that burned. They didn't fight me. They didn't argue. They simply erased me. At first, anger roared up so fast it almost felt good. My chest tightened and my hands curled into fists. I wanted to storm back downstairs and demand an explanation that made sense. I wanted to ask how long they'd been planning it. I wanted to know if Blake knew before I did. I wanted to rip the calm off their faces and replace it with accountability. For once, I didn't want to be the reasonable one. I didn't want to swallow it. But anger in my house had rules. Mine was always excessive. Theirs was always justified. So instead of confronting them, I listened. Through the vent in my room, I could hear their voices faintly drifting from the kitchen. My mother's tone was lighter now, almost relieved. My father's voice steady. Blake's low laugh cut through like it always did, confident and careless. They weren't tense. They weren't worried. They sounded like people who had solved a problem. That's when the anger shifted into something colder. This wasn't an emotional decision made in frustration. This was a strategy. They had looked at their lives, at their finances, at their comfort, and decided I was the adjustable piece, the expendable one, the one who would leave quietly because I always had. The sadness didn't crash in dramatically. It seeped in. It filled the cracks the anger couldn't hold. I looked around my room and realized how much of myself I had poured into this place. The bookshelf I bought with babysitting money. The framed photos where I was slightly off-center because Blake was always positioned first. The awards tucked into drawers because no one made space on the wall for them. I had tried so hard to belong here. I thought about all the nights I stayed up helping my mom with paperwork because Blake hated that stuff. All the mornings I drove my dad to appointments when Blake was too busy. All the times I defended them when friends said something felt off. I told everyone my family was solid. I trusted them completely. And trust isn't small. Trust is the foundation you build your identity on. When that foundation cracks, you don't just lose a house, you lose your sense of where you stand. Around midnight, I finally walked downstairs. The lights were off except for the one above the stove. My dad was sitting at the table scrolling through his phone. He looked up briefly, like I had interrupted nothing important. I asked him how long they'd been planning it. He didn't hesitate. He said it made sense financially. He said Blake needed stability. He said I was independent enough. He said I should see it as an opportunity. Opportunity. That word hit harder than if he'd yelled, because it reframed the rejection as a gift. It turned their choice into my growth. It implied I should be grateful for being cut out. I asked if they ever considered talking to me first. He shrugged. He said conversations make things messy. He said this way was cleaner. Cleaner. I realized then that I wasn't just being asked to move out. I was being removed from the narrative of the family. There would be photos without me, holidays without me, decisions made without even the pretense of including me. And they expected me to adjust quietly, to transition from daughter to visitor without friction. Surprise returned in a different form, not sharp this time but hollow. I truly believed that no matter what, blood meant something. That even if I wasn't the favorite, I was still permanent. I had never questioned my place at the core of the family structure. I had questioned my value, yes, but not my existence there. Now I saw it clearly. Blake wasn't just prioritized. He was protected. And I wasn't just overlooked. I was negotiable. That realization changed something fundamental inside me. It wasn't loud. It didn't come with tears or dramatic speeches. It was quiet and terrifyingly calm. A shift from hoping they would choose me to understanding they never would. I went back upstairs and closed my bedroom door gently, almost respectfully, like I was already practicing how to leave without making noise. I sat on the floor with my back against the bed and let the truth settle in my chest. They hadn't cut me out in anger. They had cut me out because, in their story, I was never meant to stay. And once you understand that, you stop asking how to fix it and start asking what you're going to do next. The morning after that conversation felt unreal, like I was walking through a house that had already replaced me. No one mentioned the folder. No one brought up the deadline. My mom asked if I wanted eggs. Blake complained about the Wi-Fi. My dad read the news out loud like the world outside mattered more than the fracture sitting at the breakfast table. That normalcy hurt more than yelling would have. I kept waiting for someone to soften, to say they handled it wrong, to admit it felt harsh. But the air stayed casual. That's when empathy hit me in a strange direction. Not for them, but for myself. I saw how hard I was still trying. I was still scanning their faces for reassurance, still hoping for a flicker of regret. The younger version of me was alive and well, sitting at that table, trying to decode love from crumbs. I realized I had been begging to belong my entire life without ever saying the words out loud. Every achievement had been an audition. Every sacrifice had been an investment. Every compromise had been a silent plea. If I do enough, if I help enough, if I don't complain, maybe they'll see me as permanent. The anger came back sharper this time, not explosive but focused. It wasn't just about the move-out date, it was about the years of emotional labor I had given freely. The errands, the late-night talks, the compromises. Blake never had to prove his place. His belonging was assumed. Mine was conditional. I went upstairs and started pulling clothes from my closet, not because I was ready to leave, but because I needed to feel movement. Each hanger sliding off the rod felt like a quiet protest. If they could plan my exit without consulting me, then I could prepare without consulting them. Halfway through packing a box, sadness hit in a wave that made me sit down on the floor. This wasn't just logistics. This was grief. I was grieving the version of my family I had defended for years, the one I described to friends, the one I built in my head where we were flawed but loving, uneven but loyal. That version didn't exist, and letting it die felt like losing something real. I picked up a framed photo from my desk. It was from a beach trip years ago. Blake stood in the center, arms wide, my parents flanking him proudly. I was slightly turned, mid-laugh, half out of frame. I used to think it was a funny coincidence. Now it looked symbolic. I wasn't pushed out suddenly. I had been slowly edged outward for years. That realization should have broken me completely. Instead, something steadier began to form underneath the hurt. A quiet clarity. If I stayed in this house trying to negotiate love, I would keep shrinking. If I left begging for understanding, I would keep chasing something they never intended to give. Around dinner time, my mom knocked on my door lightly and asked if I'd looked at apartment listings yet. Her tone was practical, almost cheerful. She mentioned a studio nearby that would be perfect for someone just starting out. There was no apology, no tension, just progress. That's when surprise hit again, not at their decision, but at my own reaction. I didn't feel panic. I didn't feel desperation. I felt distance. I heard her words and realized I wasn't asking her to reconsider. I wasn't arguing. I wasn't trying to explain how unfair it felt. The need to convince them had drained out of me sometime between the kitchen table and that moment. I said I'd handle it. She nodded, satisfied, and walked away. I closed the door and leaned against it, heart pounding not from fear, but from recognition. This was the turning point. Not when they handed me the folder. Not when my dad called it an opportunity. This moment, the moment I stopped begging, the anger settled into resolve. The sadness shifted into acceptance. The surprise wasn't about being cut out anymore. It was about how long I had tolerated the slow erasure before naming it. I opened my laptop and began searching for apartments. Each listing felt like a step toward something uncertain but honest. If I was going to be outside the family circle, I would choose how far. Later that night, I overheard Blake joking with my dad about finally having more space. They laughed. It stung, but not the way it would have days earlier. The pain was still there, but it wasn't destabilizing. It was information. They weren't losing sleep over losing me. And that hurt in a clean, clarifying way. I packed another box before bed. This time my hands didn't shake. I folded my clothes carefully. I wrapped fragile items in old t-shirts. I labeled the box with my own handwriting. For the first time, the future didn't look like a rejection. It looked like an exit. And as I taped that box shut, I realized something unexpected. They had cut me out. But I was the one choosing to walk away. Moving day arrived without ceremony. No dramatic goodbye. No emotional speeches. My mom stood near the doorway with her arms folded, offering short instructions about which boxes to stack first. My dad carried one box to my car and set it down like he was completing a task at work. Blake didn't come outside at all. From his bedroom window, I could see the curtain shift slightly, like he wanted to witness the outcome without participating in it. The lack of emotion should have made it easier. Instead, it felt surreal. Empathy for myself flooded in waves as I loaded the last box. I kept thinking about the 18-year-old version of me who believed families were unbreakable. The girl who thought trust was permanent. She deserved more than a quiet exit and a blank space in a household plan. She deserved to feel wanted. When I finally shut my car door and started the engine, I expected tears. I expected regret. But what I felt instead was something steadier. Relief. The drive to my tiny studio apartment was short, but it felt symbolic. Every mile put space between me and the version of myself that kept asking for permission to exist. The apartment wasn't impressive. The paint was slightly chipped. The hallway smelled faintly like old carpet. But when I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the silence felt different from the silence at home. This silence wasn't calculated. It was free. The first few days were strange. I kept expecting my phone to ring with second thoughts, an apology, a moment of clarity. Instead, the messages were brief and logistical. My mom asked for the return of a spare key. My dad reminded me about forwarding my mail. Blake didn't text at all. Anger returned in flickers. Not explosive, but simmering. How could they move on so easily? How could 18 years reduce to a forwarding address? I replayed childhood memories, searching for proof that I had imagined the warmth. I wondered if they were relieved. If my absence made dinner quieter. If my chair at the table had already been repurposed. Then sadness followed closely behind the anger. One evening, sitting alone on my floor eating takeout from the container, it hit me that no one would ever know the tiny details of my new life unless I told them. No one would ask how the apartment felt at night. No one would care that I assembled my own bookshelf and it leaned slightly to the left. Independence is empowering, but it can also be lonely in the beginning. I let myself cry that night, not because I wanted to go back, but because I finally accepted what I had lost. I hadn't just lost a bedroom. I had lost the illusion of unconditional belonging. Weeks passed. I started settling into routines. Work, groceries, paying bills, building a quiet life that didn't depend on anyone's approval. Slowly, the anger softened. The sadness dulled. The surprise faded into clarity. Then the twist came. One afternoon, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, assuming it was spam. Something made me answer. It was my aunt, my mom's older sister, someone I hadn't spoken to in months. Her voice was cautious, almost hesitant. She asked if I was okay. She asked if I had really been kicked out. The word caught me off guard. Kicked out. I told her the truth as calmly as I could. The folder, the plan, the deadline, the quiet removal. There was a long pause on the other end. Then, she said something that shifted everything. She told me my parents had been telling relatives a different story. They had said I chose to leave because I was difficult. They said I wanted independence and refused to follow house rules. They framed my exit as rebellion, not removal. For a second, I couldn't process it. Surprise surged back, sharp and disorienting. Even after cutting me out, they needed to control the narrative. They needed to protect their image. It wasn't enough to let me go quietly, they had to make sure I carried the blame publicly too. The anger that followed wasn't wild. It was precise. They hadn't just erased me from the household plan. They were rewriting me in the family story. My aunt's tones softened. She said she never believed it sounded right. She said she remembered how responsible I'd always been. She said something felt off. That call didn't fix anything, but it did something important. It validated me. For the first time, someone outside my own mind acknowledged that what happened wasn't normal. I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't difficult. I wasn't the problem they needed to remove. When the call ended, I sat in my quiet apartment and let the realization settle. They cut me out of their house, but they couldn't cut me out of the truth. And that was the final shift. I had trusted my family completely once. I believed loyalty meant silence. I believed belonging meant endurance. But now I understood something I never saw coming. Sometimes being cut out is the only way to finally see clearly. Because once the door closes behind you, you stop waiting for it to open. And you start building a life where no one can quietly decide you don't belong.